The stars stretched endlessly before the horizon's edge as it drifted through the empty space of the Kelvin sector. Captain Daniel Brooks sat in his command chair, watching the sensor readings flicker across the screens. His crew had been charting this region for 3 months now, mapping systems that no human had ever visited before. It was quiet work, sometimes boring, but Daniel knew how important it was. Humanity needed to understand this part of the galaxy if they were going to find their place among the stars. Lieutenant Amy Carter walked onto the bridge carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Daniel and took her seat at the medical station. "Another quiet day," she said, taking a sip. Daniel smiled. "That's the way I like it. No emergencies, no—" The console beeped loudly, interrupting him. Lisa Morgan, their communications officer, sat up straight in her chair. "Captain, I'm picking up a distress signal. It's faint, but it's definitely there." "Where's it coming from?" Daniel asked, setting down his coffee. "A moon orbiting the 4th planet in the system ahead. The signal is old, maybe a few weeks, but it's repeating." Daniel looked at his navigator, Kyle Martinez. "How long to get there?" "About 6 hours at current speed, sir. Take us in. Let's see what we find." The horizon's edge changed course, its engines humming as it accelerated toward the distant moon. Daniel felt the familiar mix of curiosity and caution that came with every unknown situation. In space, a distress signal could mean anything from a simple equipment failure to something far worse. 6 hours later, they entered orbit around a gray, lifeless moon. The surface was covered in dust and rocks with no atmosphere to speak of. But the sensors showed buildings down there and heat signatures that indicated life. "Lisa, can you get a visual?" Daniel asked. The main screen flickered and showed a settlement below. It wasn't large, maybe a few dozen buildings arranged around a central square, but something about the image made Daniel's stomach tighten. "Captain," Lisa said quietly, "you need to see this." She zoomed in on the square. Daniel stood up slowly, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. In the center of the square, metal pillars stood in neat rows, and tied to each pillar was a living being. Amy gasped beside him. "Oh my God." The creatures were insectoid with 4 arms and bodies covered in what looked like colorful chitin. But their colors were faded now, their bodies slumped against their restraints. Above each prisoner, a digital display showed text in multiple languages. "Kyle, get a translation on those markers," Daniel ordered. The engineer worked quickly, feeding the text through their universal translator. The results made Daniel's jaw clench. Failure to show proper respect to Drathan officials. Speaking without permission. Existing as a lesser species. "These aren't crimes," Amy said, her voice shaking. "These are excuses." Daniel stared at the screen for a long moment. He knew what he was looking at. Humanity had its own dark history, its own memories of people being punished for simply existing. He had sworn when he joined the fleet that he would never stand by and watch such things happen to others. "Prepare a landing party," he said. "Amy, bring all the medical supplies you can carry. Kyle, you're with us. Lisa, stay here and monitor the situation. If anyone shows up, I want to know immediately." They landed the shuttle in the square 20 minutes later. The moment the door opened, the smell hit them. Decay, fear, and suffering. Daniel forced himself to move forward, his boots crunching on the dusty ground. Up close, the prisoners looked even worse. Their bodies were covered in wounds, some old and some fresh. Many were unconscious. A few watched the humans approach with eyes that held no hope, only exhaustion. Amy ran to the nearest prisoner, a smaller individual who might have been a child. She pulled out her medical scanner and started working immediately. "This one's barely alive. Dehydration, malnutrition, multiple infections." "Daniel, how long have they been here?" "Too long," Daniel said. He walked to another pillar and examined the restraints. They were electronic locks, sophisticated but not impossible to break. "Kyle, can you get these off?" "Give me a minute." Kyle pulled out his tools and started working on the first lock. Daniel moved through the square, counting. 43 prisoners in total. Some were awake now, watching the humans with confusion and fear. One of them, an older individual with cracked chitin, made a sound. Lisa's voice crackled in Daniel's earpiece. "Captain, I'm detecting approach signatures. 3 ships Drathan design according to the database. They'll be here in 15 minutes. Daniel looked at Amy, who was still working on the child. "How many can we move right now?" "None of them are stable enough for transport. If we move them without treatment, some of them will die. If we don't move them, they all might die." Kyle got the first lock open. The prisoner slumped forward, and Daniel caught them before they hit the ground. The insectoid was surprisingly light, their body trembling. "Get as many free as you can," Daniel ordered. "Amy, do what you can." "We have 15 minutes. The next 15 minutes were chaos." Kyle worked frantically on the locks while Amy moved from prisoner to prisoner, injecting fluids and stabilizers. Daniel and 2 other crew members who had come down carried the freed prisoners toward the shuttle. The older Zilari that Daniel had noticed earlier grabbed his arm as he passed. Their grip was weak, but their eyes were intense. They made clicking sounds, trying to communicate. "I don't understand," Daniel said gently. The Zilari pointed at the sky, then made a pushing motion. They were trying to warn him, trying to tell him to leave. "I know they're coming," Daniel said. "But we're not leaving you here." The Zilari's eyes widened. They made the same clicking sound again, but this time it sounded different, almost like crying. By the time the Drathan ships appeared in the sky, Kyle had freed 20 prisoners. It wasn't all of them, but it was something. The ships circled overhead, their weapons clearly visible. Lisa's voice was urgent in Daniel's ear. "Captain, they're hailing us. They want you to stop immediately." Daniel looked at the prisoners still tied to the pillars, then at the ones they had saved. He thought about Earth, about humanity's own painful history, about all the times people had stood by and done nothing while others suffered. "Tell them we're providing humanitarian aid to beings in distress," Daniel said, "and tell them we're not stopping." The Drathan ships landed on the far side of the square. Soldiers emerged, tall reptilian beings in black armor. Their commander, a scarred individual with cold eyes, walked toward Daniel. "Human," the commander said in perfect English, "you are interfering with Drathan law. These prisoners are property of the Confederacy. Leave now or face the consequences." Daniel stood his ground. Behind him, Amy was still working on the prisoners. Kyle was on his 21st lock. "These are sentient beings," Daniel said, "and we're not leaving them to die." The commander's lips pulled back, showing rows of sharp teeth. "Then you have just declared war on the Drathan Confederacy. Your species will regret this decision." Daniel looked the commander in the eye. "Maybe, but we'll regret doing nothing even more." The standoff lasted for 3 hours. Daniel Brooks refused to move his people, and Commander Vektash refused to back down. The Drathan soldiers stood with their weapons ready, while the human crew continued working to free the prisoners. It was the strangest battle Daniel had ever been part of, one fought with determination rather than bullets. Finally, Vektash made a gesture, and his soldiers returned to their ships. But before he left, he looked at Daniel with something that might have been respect mixed with anger. "You have 7 days to leave this moon," Vektash said. "After that, we will remove you by force. And human, remember this. The Drathan Confederacy has crushed 100 species. What makes you think yours will be any different?" The ships lifted off, leaving dust clouds in their wake. Amy walked over to Daniel, her medical uniform stained with various colors of blood. "We got them all free," she said. "But Captain, they're in bad shape. Some of them have been here for months, maybe longer. Can you help them?" "I can try, but I need time and equipment. We should get them back to the ship." The evacuation took another 2 hours. The Zilari prisoners were weak and frightened, unsure if the humans were truly there to help or if this was some new form of torture. The older Zilari that had tried to warn Daniel stayed close to him during the transport. Back on the horizon's edge, Amy set up an emergency medical bay in the cargo hold. The Zilari lay on makeshift beds while she and her team worked to stabilize them. The ship's computer struggled to understand their biology at first, but Amy was good at her job. She adapted quickly, learning as she went. Daniel stood in the doorway watching. Kyle came up beside him. "I've been analyzing the restraints we removed," Kyle said. "They're not just locks, Captain. They're designed to cause pain. Constant low-level electrical shocks. Not enough to kill, but enough to make every moment agony." Daniel closed his eyes. "Torture devices." "Yes, sir. How widespread is this?" "Is it just this moon?" Kyle handed Daniel a tablet. "That's what I wanted to show you. I hacked into the local network before we left. Captain, this place is one of hundreds. The Drathan have these facilities across dozens of systems. And it's not just the Zilari. There are at least 6 other species being held the same way." Daniel looked at the data, his mind trying to process the scale of what they had discovered. Thousands of prisoners, maybe tens of thousands, all suffering the same fate, tied to pillars and labeled with false crimes. "I've sent an encrypted message to Earth Fleet Command," Daniel said, "but it will take 3 weeks to get there and another 3 for them to respond. We're on our own until then. What do? We stay, we help these people, and we document everything. Over the next few days, the Zalari began to recover. The youngest one, who Amy had worked on first, woke up on the second day. Through the ship's translator, they learned her name was something that sounded like a series of musical clicks. Amy started calling her Melody, and the name stuck. The older Zalari, whose name translated roughly to one who remembers, began teaching the humans about their people. He explained that the Zalari had once been artists and philosophers, known throughout the sector for their beautiful sculptures and peaceful nature. Then the Drathan came. They said we were weak. One who remembers told Daniel through the translator. They said weak species exist only to serve strong ones. They took our worlds, killed our leaders, and scattered our people. Those who resisted were sent to places like the moon. The pillaring, they call it, a warning to others. How long have you been there? Daniel asked gently. 2 cycles of seasons, more than 700 days and you're counting. Daniel felt sick. 2 years tied to a pillar, suffering constant pain with no hope of rescue. He couldn't imagine the strength it took to survive that. You're safe now, Daniel said. I promise you that. One who remembers looked at him with compound eyes that seemed to hold infinite sadness. You cannot promise such things, human Daniel. The Drathan are vast. They have fleets that darken the sky. They have conquered empires that were old when your species was young. What can one small ship do against such power? I don't know yet, Daniel admitted. But we're going to try. On the 5th day, Lisa picked up new signals. Ships were arriving in the system, but these weren't Drathan. They were coming from other species drawn by rumors of what humanity had done. A Velocian merchant captain contacted them first. We heard humans stood against the Drathan, the captain said, their translated voice filled with surprise. We had to see if it was true. It's true, Daniel replied. We found their prisoners and freed them. Impossible. No one defies the Drathan. We did. There was a long pause. Are you fools or heroes? We cannot decide. Other ships followed. Some came to trade, some came to watch, some came because they had their own grievances against the Drathan but had never dared to act. Daniel found himself giving the same explanation over and over. Yes, they had interfered. Yes, they knew the risks. No, they weren't leaving. Amy made a breakthrough on the 6th day. She had been working with Melody, trying to understand the psychological trauma the Zalari had suffered. Through careful conversation and observation, she realized that the pillaring wasn't just physical torture. It was designed to break the spirit, to make the victims internalize their own worthlessness. They're marked as lesser beings, Amy explained to Daniel, and after months or years of that message, they start to believe it. It's systematic psychological destruction. Can you help them recover? Maybe if we have time. But Daniel, this isn't just about these 43 people. If this is happening across hundreds of worlds, we're looking at millions of victims, millions of people who have been taught to hate themselves. Daniel walked to the observation deck that night. Earth was too far away to see, just one more star among billions. He thought about what one who remembers had said. What could one ship do against an empire? But then he thought about history. About ordinary people who had stood up against impossible odds. About the fact that every great change had to start somewhere, with someone deciding that enough was enough. Kyle found him there. The Drathan are coming back tomorrow. Their message says they're bringing a larger force. They want the Zalari returned and us gone, or they'll open fire. What do you think we should do? Daniel asked. Kyle was quiet for a moment. My grandfather was in the resistance during the resource wars. He used to tell me that the hardest choices are the ones where you have to decide what kind of person you want to be. We could leave. We could hand over the Zalari and probably go home safely. Or we could stay and risk everything for people we just met. And what would your grandfather say? He'd say that if you can stop suffering and choose not to, you're complicit in it. He'd say that humanity spent too long looking away from injustice and that we should know better now. Daniel nodded slowly. Get everyone together. I need to talk to the crew. 20 minutes later, the entire crew of the Horizon's Edge stood in the cargo bay. The Zalari watched from their beds, sensing something important was happening. Tomorrow the Drathan are coming back, Daniel said. They're going to demand we return our guests and leave. If we refuse, they'll likely attack. I need everyone to understand that if we stay, we might not make it home. This isn't our fight and no one would blame us for leaving. He paused, looking at each face. So I'm making this a volunteer mission. Anyone who wants to can take a shuttle and leave. No judgment, no consequences. But those who stay need to know what we're risking. The crew looked at each other. Then Amy stepped forward. I'm staying. These people need medical care, and I'm not leaving them. Kyle was next. I'm in, Lisa nodded. Someone needs to tell Earth what's happening here. Might as well be me. One by one, every crew member stepped forward, not because they were ordered to, but because they chose to. Daniel felt his throat tighten. Then we stay, and we show the galaxy what humanity stands for. One who remembers approached Daniel after the meeting. The old Zalari touched Daniel's hand gently with one of their 4 limbs. Why do you do this? One who remembers asked. Your species owes us nothing. Daniel thought about how to answer. Because we know what it's like to suffer. We know what it's like to be treated as less than sentient, and we decided a long time ago that we would never let it happen again, not if we could stop it. Even if it costs everything, especially then. The Drathan fleet arrived at dawn, if you could call it dawn in space. 6 warships this time, each one 3 times the size of the horizon's edge. They formed a blockade around the moon, their weapons locked on the human vessel. Commander Vektash's face appeared on the main screen. This is your final warning, human captain. Return the prisoners and depart, or we will destroy you. Daniel stood tall in his command chair. These people are under our protection. We're not returning them to torture. Then you die. Vektash reached for a control. Wait, Lisa shouted. Captain, I'm picking up new signatures. A lot of them. Coming in fast. The screen split to show space around them. Ships were dropping out of faster-than-light travel, one after another. Human ships. A full fleet. Daniel felt his heart race. Earth had received his message and responded faster than he thought possible. And they hadn't sent a diplomatic vessel. They had sent a battle fleet. The largest ship, a heavy carrier called the Columbus, moved into position between the horizon's edge and the Drathan fleet. A new face appeared on the screen, a woman with gray hair and sharp eyes. This is Admiral Patricia Walsh of the Earth Fleet. Commander Vektash, you will stand down immediately. Vektash's expression was one of shock and rage. This is Drathan territory. You have no authority here. We have the authority granted by the Galactic Convention on Sentient Rights, Patricia said calmly. A convention your government signed 30 years ago. We have documented evidence of systematic abuse of sentient beings across your territory, the pillaring of prisoners, torture and violation of at least 40 separate articles of galactic law. Those beings are criminals under our law. Then your law is illegal under galactic standards. We are here to ensure compliance. You have 2 options, Commander. 1. Cease all pillaring operations immediately. Release all prisoners held under this system and submit to oversight. 2. Face sanctions, military intervention, and prosecution for crimes against sentience. Daniel could see Vektash struggling to control his anger. The Drathan had clearly never been challenged like this before. You cannot threaten the Confederacy, Vektash said. We have fleets that will crush you. Perhaps. But you'll note that you're currently outnumbered in this system. And I should inform you that copies of our evidence have been transmitted to every major government in the galaxy. The Velosian Commonwealth, the Merenti Republic, and 19 other species are watching what happens here. How you respond will determine how they view your Confederacy going forward. The transmission cut off. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Admiral Walsh is requesting permission to come aboard. Captain, Lisa said. Tell her she's welcome anytime. The Admiral arrived an hour later with a security team and several specialists. She was shorter than Daniel expected, but she carried herself with absolute confidence. Captain Brooks, she said, shaking his hand. You've started quite a situation here. I didn't mean to cause an incident, Admiral. We found people suffering and couldn't walk away. I know. I read your report. That's why I'm here. She looked around the cargo bay where the Zalari were resting. How are they? Recovering. My medical officer says it will take months, maybe years, for them to fully heal. The psychological damage is extensive. Amy approached with Melody following behind her. The young Zalari had recovered enough to walk, though she still moved carefully. Admiral, Amy said, I think you should hear what they have to tell us. Over the next several hours, one who remembers and the other Zalari shared their stories with Patricia and her team. They described the Drathan occupation, the systematic destruction of their culture, and the horror of the pillaring facilities. They also provided information about other species suffering the same fate. Patricia listened without interruption, her face growing harder with each story. When they finished, she stood and walked to the observation window. Captain Brooks, she said quietly, What you stumbled into here is bigger than we thought. This isn't just a few isolated incidents. It's an entire system built on oppression. What are we going to do about it? We're going to end it. But it's not going to be easy or quick. The Drathan have military strength. They also have allies who profit from their conquests. If we push too hard, we could start a real war. And if we don't push hard enough, millions continue to suffer. Patricia turned to look at him. Exactly. That's why we need to be smart about this. We need allies, evidence, and a clear strategy. I'm setting up a humanitarian outpost here on this moon. You and your crew will run it if you're willing. Document everything. Help the Zalari rebuild. Show the galaxy what recovery looks like. We're willing, Daniel said without hesitation. The next 3 weeks were chaotic. The Drathan maintained their blockade but didn't attack, likely waiting for orders from their leadership. Meanwhile, human ships brought supplies, medical equipment, and specialists to help the Zalari. Amy worked with psychologists who specialized in trauma recovery. Together, they developed treatment programs for the Zalari. It was slow, difficult work. Many of the prisoners had nightmares. Some were afraid to leave the ship, worried that the pillars were waiting for them outside. Melody became Amy's assistant, helping to translate and explain Zalari needs. Despite her young age, she showed remarkable strength. One day, Amy asked her what she wanted to do when she was fully recovered. I want to help others, Melody said through the translator. Others like me? So no one has to be alone in the dark. Kyle led the effort to establish the outpost on the moon's surface. They built proper shelters, set up power systems, and created a memorial where the pillars had stood. Instead of removing the pillars entirely, they transformed them. Each one was wrapped in fabric bearing the name of someone who had suffered there, creating a monument to remember rather than forget. Daniel spent most of his time coordinating with Admiral Walsh and other fleet officers. The Drathan leadership had finally responded to humanity's ultimatum, and the response was not encouraging. They refused all demands and began mobilizing their fleets across multiple sectors. They're preparing for war, Patricia told Daniel during one video conference. They think we'll back down when they show force. Will we? No, but I hope it doesn't come to that. I've been reaching out to other species, building a coalition. Some are interested, but most are afraid. The Drathan have a long memory for those who oppose them. So do humans, Daniel said. Things changed when the Velocian Commonwealth made a public statement supporting humanity's position. They didn't commit military forces, but they condemned the pillaring system and called for galactic action. It was a small step, but it mattered. Then the Pravashi, an insectoid species similar to the Zalari, went further. They announced they would no longer work in Drathan factories until the pillaring ended. It was a labor strike on a massive scale. One who remembers watched the news broadcasts with intense focus. They are inspired by what you did, the old Zalari told Daniel. You showed them that resistance is possible. We just did what was right. That is precisely what makes it powerful. For so long, everyone believed the Drathan could not be challenged. You proved that belief wrong. On the 30th day since the standoff began, Admiral Walsh called an emergency meeting. Daniel rushed to the communications room. We have a problem, Patricia said. The Drathan are moving a major fleet toward the Zalari homeworld. Intelligence suggests they are planning to retaliate against the entire species for what happened here. Daniel felt cold dread wash over him. How many ships? 50, maybe more. If they reach the homeworld, they could kill millions. We have to stop them. We will. I'm taking the fleet to intercept. But Daniel, I need you to do something for me. The Zalari survivors you have with you, they're witnesses. They can testify about what they experienced. I need that testimony recorded officially so it can be used in galactic courts. Can you do that? Of course. Good. Because one way or another this is going to end soon. And when it does, the galaxy needs to understand exactly what the Drathan have been doing. After the call ended, Daniel gathered the Zalari. He explained what was needed. One by one, they agreed to tell their stories on record, despite their fear and trauma. The recordings took days. Each Zalari spoke about their capture, their time on the pillars, and what they had witnessed. Some could barely get through their accounts. Others spoke with quiet determination. When Melody gave her testimony, Amy sat beside her, holding her hand. The young Zalari described being taken from her family, watching her parents killed for protesting, and spending months tied to a pillar wondering if anyone would ever come. But someone did come, Melody said at the end. The humans came. They saw us suffering and decided it was wrong. They didn't have to help us. We were strangers, but they helped anyway. That is what I want to remember. Not just the darkness, but the moment when someone turned on a light. Daniel watched the recordings later that night. He thought about how easy it would have been to ignore that first distress signal, to chart a different course, to convince himself that it wasn't humanity's problem, but they hadn't. And because of that choice, everything had changed. The Drathan fleet never reached the Zilari homeworld. Admiral Walsh intercepted them 3 systems away. And what followed was the first real military engagement between humanity and the Drathan Confederacy. Daniel listened to the battle reports from the outpost, feeling helpless. He was a scientist and explorer, not a warrior. But he understood that sometimes good people had to fight to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The battle lasted 18 hours. Human ships used tactics the Drathan hadn't expected, focusing on disabling rather than destroying enemy vessels. It was a strategy born from humanity's own painful history with war. They remembered what it was like to be on the receiving end of overwhelming force, and they refused to become the thing they had once fought against. Commander Greg Patterson led a squadron of destroyers that managed to disable 7 Drathan ships without killing most of their crews. When the Drathan survivors were rescued, they expected execution or torture. Instead, they received medical treatment and decent food. One Drathan soldier injured during the battle was treated by a human medic. He kept asking why they were helping him. "Because you're hurt," the medic said simply. "That's reason enough." The soldier stared at her like she had spoken an alien language. In a way, she had. News of the battle and its aftermath spread across the galaxy faster than light. Footage showed human medical teams treating enemy wounded with the same care as their own people. It showed Drathan prisoners being given beds and meals instead of chains and beatings. It showed a stark contrast between how the 2 species treated those in their power. Public opinion began to shift. Species that had been neutral suddenly started questioning the Drathan Confederacy's version of events. If the humans were really the aggressors, why were they treating prisoners so well? If the Drathan were really the victims, why had the humans found torture facilities? But the most significant change came from within Drathan-controlled space itself. The subject species, watching humans stand against their oppressors, found courage they didn't know they had. On Pravashi Prime, the factory strike expanded. Workers refused to return until all pillaring facilities were shut down. The Drathan sent troops to force them back to work, but the workers stood firm. They chanted in their native language, words that translated roughly to "We are not lesser." On Zilari colony worlds, artists began creating again. They had been forbidden from making art under Drathan rule, told it was a waste of time for servants. But now they painted murals on buildings, sculpted statues in public squares, and sang songs that had been silent for years. Each piece of art was an act of defiance. Even some of the Drathan's own subject species began to question their orders. A group of junior officers on one of the damaged warships refused to return to duty, demanding to know why they were fighting to protect a system built on torture. Back on the moon, now officially renamed Haven's Rest by the Zilari survivors, Daniel watched these developments with hope and concern. Hope because change was happening. Concern because he knew revolutions could turn violent quickly. "Captain," Kyle said one morning, "we're getting requests for help from other species. Hundreds of messages asking if humans can come to their worlds too." Daniel read through some of the messages. They were heartbreaking. Beings who had suffered for years under Drathan rule, suddenly daring to hope that freedom might be possible. "We can't help everyone," Daniel said quietly. "We don't have enough ships, enough people. I know. But maybe we don't have to do it alone." Kyle was right. Over the next few weeks, other species began joining the coalition. The Velocian Commonwealth committed medical ships. The Merenti Republic sent engineers to help rebuild damaged worlds. Even the normally isolationist Quaresh offered their diplomatic expertise. It wasn't a military alliance, not yet. But it was something more powerful. It was a group of different species saying together that the pillaring system was wrong and had to end. Admiral Walsh returned to Haven's Rest after the battle. She looked exhausted but satisfied. "We won the battle," she told Daniel. "But the war isn't over. The Drathan Supreme Council is divided. Some want to negotiate, others want to fight until the end. We need to keep the pressure on while giving them a way to back down without losing face." "How do we do that?" by showing them that the galaxy has changed, that their old way of doing things won't work anymore. Patricia pulled up a holographic display showing multiple star systems. I've been coordinating with the Coalition. We're planning simultaneous operations across 12 systems. Not military strikes, but humanitarian missions. We'll go to the pillaring facilities, free the prisoners, and document everything. You want to do what we did here, but everywhere at once. Exactly. The Drathan can't stop all of us, and every freed prisoner, every documented abuse strengthens our case. Amy joined them, with Melody translating for One Who Remembers. The old Zalari wanted to speak. We wish to help, One Who Remembers said. The Zalari who you saved. We want to go with your teams, to show other prisoners that rescue is real, that freedom is possible. It could be dangerous, Patricia warned. We have lived with danger every day for years. This is a danger we choose for a purpose that matters. Daniel looked at the old Zalari with respect. You're very brave. No, you are brave. We are simply grateful and determined that our suffering should mean something. The coordinated operation launched 3 weeks later. 12 human ships, accompanied by vessels from 6 other species, moved simultaneously toward 12 different Drathan pillaring facilities. The Drathan tried to respond but found themselves overwhelmed. They couldn't defend everywhere at once. Daniel went on one of the missions himself, leading a team to a facility similar to the one where they had first found the Zalari. This time they found Pravashi prisoners, the insectoid workers who had gone on strike. The scene was familiar and horrifying. Prisoners tied to pillars, digital markers displaying false crimes, bodies weak from abuse. But this time Daniel knew exactly what to do. His team worked efficiently, freeing prisoners and providing immediate medical care. One of the Pravashi prisoners, a female whose name sounded like wind chimes, grabbed Daniel's hand as he freed her. You are human? She asked in broken common language. Yes. We hear stories. We hear humans fight the Drathan. We think stories are lies. Drathan say no one will help us. The Drathan were wrong, Daniel said. You're not alone anymore. Across all 12 facilities, similar scenes played out. Thousands of prisoners freed in a single day. The galactic news networks covered every moment. The images were impossible to ignore. Species that had tried to remain neutral found themselves forced to take a position. The Drathan Supreme Council met in emergency session. The debate was heated and went on for days. Finally, they sent a message to the Coalition. They were willing to talk. Admiral Walsh, representing humanity and the Coalition, met with Drathan diplomats on a neutral station. Daniel listened to the negotiations remotely, along with billions of others across the galaxy. The Drathan delegation tried to minimize their actions at first. They claimed the pillaring was necessary for security, that the prisoners were dangerous criminals, that other species didn't understand their culture. Patricia listened patiently, then played the testimony videos. Hours of survivors describing what they had endured. Melody telling her story. One Who Remembers explaining how Zalari culture had been systematically destroyed. Pravashi workers showing scars from electrical torture. When the videos finished, the room was silent. These are not security measures, Patricia said quietly. This is systematic abuse. And it ends now. The negotiations took weeks, but slowly an agreement formed. The Drathan would shut down all pillaring facilities. They would release all prisoners held under the system. They would allow inspectors from multiple species to verify compliance, and they would face a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to address the harm they had caused. It wasn't everything the Coalition wanted. There were no direct prosecutions, no reparations, but it was progress. Back on Haven's Rest, the Zalari gathered to watch the announcement of the agreement. When it was confirmed, they didn't cheer. They were too exhausted for that. But they held each other and cried tears of relief. It's over, Melody said, leaning against Amy. The pillars are gone. Not gone, One Who Remembers corrected gently, but broken. The pillars of metal may still stand in some places, but the pillars of fear are broken. That is what matters. Daniel stood outside that night looking up at the stars. He thought about how this all started with a simple distress signal, a decision to investigate rather than ignore. He thought about all the people across the galaxy who were waking up free for the first time in years, people who had thought they would die tied to pillars, forgotten and alone, people who now knew that someone had cared enough to stand against injustice. Kyle found him there. Earth Fleet is sending a ship to relieve us. We can go home if we want. Do you want to go home? Kyle shrugged. Part of me does, but part of me feels like the work here isn't finished. The pillars are gone, but these people need time to heal. Someone should stay and help. My thoughts exactly, Daniel said. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars and thinking about the future. 6 months had passed since the agreement was signed. The galaxy was a different place now, though the changes were sometimes hard to see unless you knew where to look. Daniel Brooks stood in what had once been a square of torture and was now a garden of remembrance. The metal pillars still stood, but they were barely recognizable. The Zalari had wrapped them in living vines from their homeworld, plants that produced flowers in every color imaginable. Each pillar bore a plaque with names not of crimes but of those who had suffered there. "It's beautiful," Amy said, walking up beside him. She had stayed on Haven's Rest as the chief medical coordinator for the recovery program. Her work had expanded far beyond the original 43 prisoners they had rescued. Now she oversaw treatment programs across 12 worlds. "It feels right," Daniel agreed. "Remembering without forgetting, but also showing that life continues." Melody appeared from behind one of the pillars, now completely healthy and serving as a junior translator. She had grown taller in the past months, her chitin bright with the colors of youth. "Captain Daniel," she said, her human speech much improved. "The ceremony will begin soon. Are you ready?" Today was the official dedication of the memorial and the establishment of the Galactic Sentient Rights Coalition. Leaders from 20 different species were arriving to sign the founding document. It was a moment that would reshape galactic politics for generations. Admiral Patricia Walsh landed first, her ship touching down where the Drathan vessels had once threatened to destroy them all. She wore her dress uniform, medals gleaming in the light. "Captain Brooks," she greeted him formally, then smiled and shook his hand. "Or should I say Coordinator Brooks? I hear they're offering you the position of director for the Haven's Rest facility." "I haven't decided yet," Daniel said. "Part of me misses exploring, but part of me knows this work is important. Both are true. But Daniel, what you started here matters more than any system we could chart. You showed the galaxy that someone would stand up against injustice. That's worth more than any discovery." Other delegates began arriving. The Velosian ambassador, whose government had been first to support humanity's stance, the Pravashi labor leader who had organized the strikes, the Marenti engineers who had helped rebuild damaged worlds, even a few Drathan representatives, younger officers who had broken ranks to support reform. One who remembers greeted each arrival personally. The old Zalari had become something of a symbol, the face of survival and recovery. But Daniel knew the weight that fame carried, and he worried about his friend. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Daniel had asked the night before. "Speaking in front of everyone, reliving everything?" "I am sure," one who remembers had replied. "Because if I do not speak, others may forget. And if they forget, it could happen again. My pain can have purpose. That makes it bearable." The ceremony began as the sun reached its highest point. Delegates gathered around a platform built where the first pillar had stood. The Zalari choir sang a traditional song of mourning that transformed into one of hope. Daniel didn't understand the words, but he felt their meaning in his bones. Admiral Walsh spoke first, outlining the structure of the new coalition. It would have 3 branches: humanitarian aid, military intervention for extreme cases, and long-term recovery programs. Its mission was simple but profound: ensure that what happened to the Zalari and others would never happen again. "This coalition is not about human power," Patricia said clearly. "It's not about any one species dominating others. It's about all of us agreeing on a basic truth, that sentient beings have rights that cannot be taken away by force or law or tradition. That suffering is not acceptable simply because it's convenient for the powerful." The Pravashi labor leader spoke next, describing how the strikes had given her people hope. The Marenti engineer explained how rebuilding had brought different species together. Each speaker added to a growing picture of a galaxy learning to stand against oppression. Then it was one who remembers turn. The old Zalari walked slowly to the platform, leaning on a cane carved from wood brought from the Zalari homeworld. The crowd fell silent. "I have lived 147 cycles," one who remembers began, the translators carrying the words to everyone present. "I have seen my people create beauty and live in peace. I have seen them conquered and broken. I have felt metal against my body and electricity in my nerves. I have known despair so deep I thought it would swallow me whole. The old Zalari paused, looking around at the transformed square. But I have also seen something I never thought possible. I have seen strangers become rescuers. I have seen people with no reason to care decide that caring is reason enough. The humans found us, and they could have left. Their government could have chosen not to respond. Their species could have decided we were not their problem. But they did not, and that choice changed everything. Not because humans are perfect. They are not. Not because they were stronger than the Drathan. They were not. But because when they saw suffering, they decided it was wrong, and that was enough to make them act. One who remembers turned to look directly at Daniel. Captain Daniel Brooks and the crew of the Horizon's Edge did not save only 43 Zalari that day. They saved the idea that rescue is possible, that someone will come, that we are not alone, and that idea spread like light through darkness, giving hope to millions who had none. So today we do not just remember suffering. We do not just celebrate freedom. We commit ourselves to being the ones who come when others are in darkness. We commit to being the light, as humanity was light for us. The speech ended with the signing of the founding document. Each delegate added their name or mark to the agreement, committing their species to uphold sentient rights and provide aid to those suffering oppression. When the ceremony ended, there was no grand celebration. Instead, people moved through the garden, reading the names on the plaques, touching the flowers, and quietly acknowledging the cost of the freedom they now enjoyed. Kyle found Daniel near the pillar, where they had first freed one who remembers. "The supply ships are leaving tomorrow," Kyle said. "I'm going with them. Back to Earth and probably another exploration mission." "You're leaving?" Daniel felt a pang of loss. Kyle had been with him through everything. "Yeah, but I wanted to thank you first, for making the decision to stay that day, for showing me what it means to actually stand for something. I'll carry that with me wherever I go." They shook hands, and Daniel watched his friend walk away, knowing some partnerships were meant for specific moments rather than lifetimes. Amy approached as evening fell, bringing 2 cups of the warm beverage the Zalari favored. "I'm staying," she said without preamble. "They've asked me to run the psychological recovery program across all the former pillaring worlds. It's a huge job, years of work, but I think I can help. You already have helped, more than you know. Maybe. But there are thousands more who need what I can offer. And honestly, Daniel, I can't imagine going back to regular medical work after this. How do you go back to treating routine injuries when you know there are people out there suffering from years of systematic torture?" Daniel understood. He felt the same pull. That night he walked through the garden alone. The flowers glowed softly in the darkness, a genetic trait the Zalari had bred into them long ago. It made the entire square look like a field of stars. He thought about the question Admiral Walsh had posed months ago. What can one ship do against an empire? The answer he now knew was everything. One ship, one crew, one moment of moral courage had sparked a movement that reshaped the galaxy. But he also knew the work wasn't finished. The coalition was new and fragile. There were still species suffering in corners of the galaxy that hadn't been reached. The Drathan had agreed to reforms, but old habits died hard, and some facilities were still operational in remote regions. And there were other empires out there, other systems of oppression that would test humanity's commitment to its ideals. Melody found him there. She sat beside him without speaking for a while, just enjoying the peaceful night. "I'm going to Earth," she said finally. "They have a program for survivors who want to study human history. I want to understand how you got from your wars and suffering to being the ones who rescue others. Maybe I can bring those lessons back to my people." "That's a wonderful idea. Captain Daniel, can I ask you something? When you found us that first day, were you afraid?" Daniel considered the question honestly. "Yes, I was terrified. Not of the Drathan, though they were scary enough. I was afraid of making the wrong choice. Afraid of what would happen to my crew if we stayed. Afraid that we weren't strong enough or smart enough to help. But you stayed anyway. We stayed anyway. Why?" Daniel looked at the glowing flowers, thinking about how to explain. "Because fear isn't a good reason to walk away from people who need help. And because I kept thinking about history, about all the times people stood by and did nothing while others suffered. I didn't want to be one of those people. I wanted to be someone who at least tried." Melody nodded slowly. "That's what I want too, to be someone who tries." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the garden glow. Admiral Walsh sent a message the next day, offering Daniel command of a new vessel being built specifically for humanitarian missions. It would be